She knew the rules: arrive early, stay invisible, survive the day. Working for Ronan Moratini was walking a razor's edge. One slip and everything bled. But that morning, in his office, with Manhattan glittering behind the glass, she made the worst possible mistake. She looked where she shouldn't. Once, twice, a third time, he caught it. "Why don't you stop looking at the bulge in my pants?" He asked it with the calm of a man who already had the answer. She wanted to vanish, wanted the floor to split open and swallow her whole. Ronan Moratini wouldn't let her. He leaned in, braced his hands on the arms of her chair, and pinned her there with his eyes. She froze, not because of the question, because of what came next. Chapter 1. The elevator knew before I did. Moratini Holdings had been the destination in my head since the second year of business school. I'd pored over their annual reports the way other students pored over textbooks before a final memorized 5 years of growth figures, and kept a folder on my laptop stuffed with analyses nobody had ever requested. The company was the blueprint for everything I wanted my career to become. So when Helena Voss, my strategic management professor, a woman I'd looked up to since her very first lecture, pulled me aside after a class presentation and mentioned an opening in Moratini's administrative department, something inside me shifted. It wasn't fear. It was hunger. My resume went out that same afternoon. What followed stretched nearly a month. Technical exams that reached into corners of knowledge I'd barely grazed in college, 3 separate rounds of interviews with executive panels who studied me like they were searching for some hidden fault line, and a stack of confidentiality agreements so dense I spent 2 full hours reading before I could bring myself to sign. I made it through every stage. I got the job. And when the confirmation email arrived, I was sitting on the floor of my Brooklyn apartment with my laptop balanced on my knees, and I cried the way I always did anything that mattered, alone, and without making a sound. That hire was the payoff, proof that every sacrifice had been worth something. The 2 jobs I juggled through college, the 3 a.m. nights with my eyes burning against the glow of a screen, the mother who'd raised me by herself from the time I was 7, the year my father figured out that walking through the front door was easier than staying behind it. All of it had led here. I deserved this. For 6 months, I'd been repeating that to myself every morning. And every morning, stepping into that building, I felt something close to pride. The boss was the only thing that spoiled it. Ronan Moratini couldn't tolerate a single variable beyond his reach, and the minute I entered the floor, fell well within that perimeter. I showed up 15 minutes ahead of schedule every day without fail, and he still managed to find something to pick apart. A report with the wrong margins, a misplaced comma, coffee brought to the 9 o'clock meeting 2 degrees under whatever temperature he'd privately decreed acceptable. He was demanding in a way that felt deliberate, almost amused, as though he enjoyed watching me hold my posture while he took my work apart in that low, steady voice that never needed volume to empty a room. I hated him. That was what I told myself, at least, every time his cologne drifted too close, and something twisted low in my stomach that I refused to call what it was. On that particular Monday, the alarm went off at 6:45, and I was already awake. Not nerves, routine. My body had given up on sleeping in years ago. I crossed the narrow hallway of my apartment, with its thin walls and the muffled soundtrack of neighbors I knew by their footsteps, and went to the kitchen. The coffee maker gave its usual mechanical grumble. I leaned against the counter and drank the first mouthful standing up, checking the time on my phone. 7:10. Plenty of margin. The apartment was small, but it was mine, paid for with money I'd earned and nobody else's. I grabbed my bag from the hook behind the door, confirmed the folder with the morning's reports was tucked inside, and left. Brooklyn at that hour smelled of damp concrete and the warm yeast drifting out of bakeries that opened before the rest of the world remembered to. I walked the 4 blocks to the subway with my earbuds still in my pocket, because I liked to hear the city surfacing from sleep. The train was packed. I pinned my bag against my side and gripped the metal pole while the car rattled under the river toward Manhattan. By 7:40, I was out of the station and cutting across the last 2 blocks to Moratini Tower. The building took up most of a block in lower Midtown. Dark glass, severe lines, the sort of architecture that didn't announce wealth so much as assume it. The lobby was gray marble threaded with gold, and the quiet inside had a weight to it, the kind that straightened your spine before you noticed. The guard at reception gave me the same small nod he gave every morning, and I crossed to the elevators. The doors slid open with that soft pneumatic sigh, and I stepped inside, alone. I pressed 42, drifted to the back wall, and adjusted the strap on my shoulder while the floor numbers climbed. That's when I felt it. Nobody was in there with me. I'd checked before stepping in, but the sensation was unmistakable. Someone was watching, My gaze flicked up to the top right corner, a security camera, exactly as there'd be in any corporate elevator in Manhattan. The small red light beside the lens pulsed in a steady rhythm. Nothing unusual, just a camera. But for reasons I couldn't explain, the awareness of being watched pressed down on me hard enough that I held my breath for a second, before dropping my eyes back to my phone and pretending to be busy. The elevator opened on 42, and I stepped out walking like a woman who hadn't just been unsettled by a lens. Moratini's executive floor was wide open, glass partitions, desks aligned with nearly surgical precision, and a view of Manhattan that unfurled across the horizon. I made my way to my desk in the admin wing, third on the left past the main corridor, dropped my bag into the drawer, and woke up the computer. The morning rolled through its usual rhythm. Emails, spreadsheets, a contract review that ate up close to an hour. Then, sometime around 10, my desk phone rang. Internal line. The number on the display was one I knew without looking, because it called at least 3 times a week with the same clipped cadence of someone about to ruin part of my day. Ronan Moratini's office sat at the far end of the 42nd floor corridor behind a double door of dark wood that matched its owner. Heavy, imposing, engineered to intimidate before it ever opened. I walked down the hallway, running a silent inventory of every mistake I might have made that morning, knocked twice, and pushed the door open, when his voice said only, "Come in. No please. No good morning." None of the small courtesies other people bothered with. He was on his feet, back to the panoramic window that framed Manhattan like a painting he'd commissioned. Tall, dark-haired, jaw cut as though whoever designed it had something against soft edges. The sleeves of his dark dress shirt were rolled to the elbow, exposing the tattoos that ran down both forearms, designs I'd never let myself study long enough to read, because lingering there for more than 2 seconds was something my professional self-preservation had firmly outlawed. Beside him, leaning against the bookcase with the posture of a man monitoring the room without appearing to, was Cillian Dark, Ronan's right hand, his closest friend. Cillian was 33, Irish-American, and in all the months I'd been there, I'd never heard him string more than 2 sentences together in a single conversation. He watched everything and reacted to almost nothing. Where Ronan went, Cillian went, always a pace behind, steady as a shadow that had chosen its body. Ronan pulled me into the conversation with no preamble, asking about a report I'd sent the previous Friday. He gestured with one hand while he spoke, the other resting on the edge of the desk, and I kept my eyes exactly where a professional employee should keep them, on his face. Then he moved, a step to one side, a slight shift of weight, and the line of his dress pants adjusted in a way I wasn't remotely prepared for. There was no unseeing it. I looked away so fast I nearly pulled something in my neck, fixing my gaze on a blue folder on the desk as if it were the most interesting object ever manufactured. But that's the problem with being caught off guard. The brain refuses to let it go. It has to loop back, just once, to confirm what it thinks it saw. Mine did exactly that. My eyes dropped again, quick and involuntary, a reflex I hadn't signed off on, and snapped back up before I could fully hate myself. Inside my head, a voice that sounded suspiciously like Tessa's started making suggestions I needed to smother immediately. Commentary that had absolutely no business surfacing during a meeting with the company's CEO. I set my jaw, clasped my hands in front of me, and forced my attention onto profit margins. No more looking. He was my boss. This job was the one thing I'd genuinely built for myself, and there wasn't a universe in which throwing it away over a well-tailored pair of trousers counted as acceptable. But I'd already looked more times than I should have. And when I lifted my eyes to his face, what I found made the floor drop out from under me. Ronan was looking right back. Not at the folder, not at the report, not at anything connected to the work. At me, with a focus that told me, beyond any possible doubt, that he'd registered every second my gaze had been somewhere it shouldn't have been. Cillian straightened, murmured something brief I didn't catch, and crossed to the door. He left unhurriedly. The door shut behind him with a soft click that landed absurdly loud in the quiet that followed. We were alone. The office seemed to shrink around us. The air thickened, and the smile that began to form at the corner of Ronan's mouth, slow, controlled, shadowed by something I wasn't willing to name, told me whatever conversation was coming had nothing to do with profit margins. Chapter 2. 1 month. No exceptions. He didn't ask right away. That would have counted as mercy. And mercy didn't appear to belong anywhere in Ronan Moratini's personal lexicon. What he did was worse. He let 3 seconds of silence stretch between us, long enough for the heat to climb up my neck, and then picked up exactly where he'd left off, as if nothing had interrupted him. He went over the margins. He wanted the revision on his desk by Wednesday. He dismissed me with a slight tilt of the head and a "you can go" pitched too casually to actually be casual. I walked out of his office on autopilot and spent the rest of the morning pretending I could focus on spreadsheets, while his jaw, his smile, and the damn outline in his trousers took turns rotating through my head like a carousel nobody had thought to switch off. At 2 p.m, my desk phone rang again. Same number. Same conviction that something was about to go spectacularly wrong. For the second time that day, I made the walk down the 42nd floor corridor, and this time I didn't need to knock. The door stood ajar. I pushed against the dark wood and stepped inside. The office had changed since morning. The blinds were halfway down. The Manhattan light filtered through in softer slices, and the glass of whiskey on his desk was no longer pristine. Someone had drunk from it and topped it up again. Cillian was nowhere in sight. The leather armchair facing the desk had been angled toward where I'd entered, as though he'd positioned it in advance. He was leaning against the edge of his desk, arms folded, and he watched me cross the office without speaking a single word. I stopped at what felt like a safe distance, 2 meters, maybe 3, and opened my mouth to ask what he needed. Before any sound made it out, he pushed off the desk and started toward me with the unhurried ease of a man who owned every second of the day and knew precisely how he intended to spend the next few. I didn't back up. I should have. Ronan stopped in front of me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, and then he did something that locked every muscle in my body in place. He bent down slowly, set both hands on the arms of the leather chair beside me, and brought himself level with my eyes. The tattoos on his forearms were inches from my face, so close I could finally make out what I'd never let myself look at before. Dark lines curling into something that suggested an animal buried inside the design. But my brain wasn't interested in decoding anything, while Ronan Moratini's face was 12 inches from mine. Sit. It wasn't a request. My body obeyed before my mind bothered giving clearance, and I dropped into the chair with what I'd charitably call the bare minimum of dignity. He didn't step back. He stayed exactly where he was, hands braced on the armrests, caging me in without a single point of contact, and the half-smile I was already learning to dread settled over his mouth before he spoke. "Why don't you stop looking at the bulge in my pants?" The question landed in the air like a silent detonation. My face went hot so quickly I felt the heat crawl up into my ears, and my eyes, traitors to the very end, scrambled for somewhere to land that wasn't him. The window, the desk, the whiskey glass, the ceiling, anything. But there was no escape, because he was too close and his gaze was locked on mine, with an intensity that didn't leave room for retreat. I started, and my voice came out so thin the sentence collapsed before I could finish it. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You do," he said, and the way he said it turned the single word into something that had no business existing inside an office. I wanted to die. I wanted the floor of the 42nd floor to split open and drop me straight down to the basement and spit me out on some Brooklyn sidewalk where no one had ever heard the name Moratini. But the floor stayed solid, and he stayed exactly where he was, and his smile sharpened in a way that made it obvious he was enjoying this far more than anyone decent should enjoy someone else's humiliation. Then he did something I hadn't braced for. He moved closer, and I forgot how to breathe, until his mouth was inches from my ear, close enough that the heat of his breath brushed my skin, that his cologne hit me in full, wood, and something darker underneath that I couldn't name. Every hair on my arm stood up. My knuckles went white on the armrests. He didn't say anything. He just stayed there, in that impossible proximity, for 2 or 3 seconds that felt like years, testing, watching, reading my body the way someone reads a set of numbers on a screen, and liking what he saw, and then he straightened all at once. He pulled back, smoothed down his sleeves with the composure of a man who'd just glanced at his watch, and walked around to his side of the desk without looking at me. He picked up the glass of whiskey, took a slow sip, and set it back down with a neat click. "Wednesday," he said, dropping into his chair as if the last minutes had never taken place. "You can go." I left the office on unsteady legs with a ringing in my ears that lasted until the elevator. He hadn't explained anything, hadn't clarified anything. He'd asked the question, invaded my space, gauged my reaction, and walked away, leaving me with a racing pulse and a head full of questions that only kept multiplying. By 6:30, I was on the subway heading back toward Brooklyn. By 7, I was inside my apartment with the door locked and my phone in my hand. Tessa picked up on the second ring. "Judging by the way you're breathing, Either you just ran 3 blocks or something happened that I need to be sitting down for, said Tessa Wynn, my best friend since we were 18, a freelance graphic designer who lived 2 blocks from my building and had a natural gift for converting any disaster into comedy material. Tessa, I was already pacing. I need to tell you something, and I need you not to lose it. Anytime somebody tells me not to lose it, losing it is mandatory. Go. I tried to do this with some kind of composure. I tried for professional terminology, a neutral tone, the facts laid out in order. What actually came out of my mouth was a disjointed, chaotic version of the afternoon, full of half-sentences and noises that weren't quite words, and when I finally reached the part about why don't you stop looking at the bulge in my pants, Tessa went silent for 3 whole seconds, which, for her, was the equivalent of a full hour of contemplation, before detonating. Wait, stop. The hot CEO said that? Those exact words? To your face? To my face. 12 inches away, to be precise. And what did you say? The silence I returned was its own answer. Lyra Ashford, she said in the voice of someone about to deliver a legal verdict. You're telling me the hottest man in your building asked why you keep staring at the main event, and you said nothing. I froze, Tessa. Froze. My brain shut off and didn't restart until he told me to leave. You froze like a deer in headlights, she confirmed. A very pretty deer, but still a deer. Paralyzed, in the middle of the road. Truck coming. Thanks for the visual. You're welcome. Now, back to the matter at hand. The bulge. Give me a scale. Are we talking noteworthy, or do we need to file something with a scientific archive? Tessa! It's a legitimate question. You're the eyewitness. I need the data to form an opinion. I collapsed onto the couch and pressed a pillow over my face, because laughing felt inappropriate given the circumstances, except the sound leaked out through the fabric anyway, and Tessa took that as a full green light. You should have said something devastating, something that would have pulled the rug out from under him. Something like, I'm not staring. I'm just trying to work out how that's physically possible. It would have been iconic, Lyra. You had a shot at iconic and you missed it. I laughed again, and this time I didn't bother muffling it, because Tessa had that particular ability. She could take the most humiliating moment of my life and hand it back to me wrapped in a joke that made me believe, for just a second, that I might actually survive this. But when I hung up, and the apartment settled back into its silence, the laughter evaporated as fast as it had arrived. Because the truth, underneath all the comedy, was that Ronan Moratini had cornered me, asked the most humiliating question of my professional life, leaned in close enough to stop my breathing, and walked away like none of it had happened. And the worst part, the part that actually scared me, wasn't the humiliation. It was that in the seconds when his mouth was near my ear, part of me hadn't wanted him to pull back. Tuesday morning, I ran the same route as always. Apartment, subway, lobby, elevator, 42nd floor, repeating to myself that it was going to be an ordinary day, that yesterday had been a one-off, a glitch, something that wouldn't happen again because I wasn't going to allow it to happen again. I sat at my desk, powered up the computer, and threw myself at my inbox with the focused determination of a woman laying bricks in a wall between herself and the corridor leading to his office. The wall lasted 40 minutes. At 9:40, the phone rang. I already knew what it was. I went anyway, because not going would have been worse. It would have been an admission that he affected me, and I couldn't hand him that. I walked down the corridor, knocked, stepped inside. This time, Ronan was seated behind the desk, and the whole register of the room was different from anything I'd seen from him until then. No smile, no provocation, none of the proximity that stole the air out of me. He gestured toward the chair across from him with a short motion of his hand, and waited until I sat down. I have a proposal, he said, and something in the weight of his voice pulled my spine straight. He slid open a side drawer and drew out a slim black leather folder. He set it on the desk between us and opened it. Inside was a multi-page document bearing the Moratini Holdings letterhead and signatures from lawyers I'd never heard of. I want you to sleep with me. He said it the way someone might ask you to review a contract. For a month. Under contract. I blinked. Once. Twice. I waited for the moment when he'd tell me it was a joke, a test, anything that would let the sentence slot into reality. It didn't come. In exchange, he went on, turning a few pages and sliding the document toward me, your position is guaranteed. Not for 6 months. Not for a year. Permanently. The contract protects your role, your benefits, your security within the company. You get everything and lose nothing. This is absurd. My voice came out steadier than I'd expected, which gave me just enough nerve to keep going. "You're my boss. None of this makes any sense." "It makes sense to me." He leaned back in his chair and looked at me in a way that wasn't yesterday's provocation. There was no game in it this time. There was something stripped and direct underneath that caught me entirely off guard. "Yesterday, in the elevator," he said, and his voice dropped half a tone. "I was in the security room when you got in, alone, distracted, adjusting the strap on your shoulder without realizing anyone was watching. My hands went cold on the armrests. I stayed there," he said, and his eyes didn't move from mine, "watching you on that screen, and I started thinking things I shouldn't think about a woman who works for me. What it would be like to have you close. What I'd do if we were alone. What sound you'd make if I touched you." The air in the room turned dense. I wanted to interrupt. I wanted to tell him this was harassment, that he couldn't speak to me like this. But my voice had abandoned me entirely, and all I could do was grip the chair and listen. "That's why I was hard when you walked into my office yesterday morning," he said, without looking away, without the faintest trace of embarrassment. "Because I'd spent the last half hour thinking about you." My body moved faster than I could get it under control. My face burned again, but not in the same way as before. This wasn't just shame. It was the impact of understanding that the outline I'd been trying to ignore, that I'd looked at without meaning to, that had unraveled my composure in front of my boss, had existed because of me, because of images he'd constructed while watching me on a surveillance monitor. "I wanted you before yesterday," he added, and there was something in his voice that sounded like a confession, and a warning in the same breath. "Yesterday was just the day I stopped bothering to pretend I didn't." He nudged the contract a few inches closer with 2 fingers. "Read it. I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm asking you to consider it. I don't need to consider it." The firmness in my voice surprised me as much as it surprised him. "The answer is no." The word cut the space between us clean. Something shifted in his face for a second. It wasn't anger, and it wasn't disappointment. It was fascination. The corner of his mouth lifted, just barely, and he sat back in the chair wearing an expression I could only describe as satisfied. "You're the first woman who's ever told me no," he said, low and slow, and the way he said it turned the refusal into the most intriguing thing he'd heard in a long time. I grabbed the folder, shoved it into my bag without thinking, got up, and walked out without looking back. I made it down the corridor at a clipped pace, dropped into my chair, and stared at my monitor without reading a single word. I'd said no. I knew I'd said no. My mouth had shaped the word. Air had moved across my vocal cords. The sound had reached him. No, but the folder was still in my bag, and its weight, pressing against my leg, was too heavy to pretend wasn't there. Chapter 3. I said no, my body didn't listen. On Wednesday morning, I arrived at Moratini Tower with a clear strategy. Maintain maximum distance from Ronan Moratini, avoid the main corridor, avoid the executive wing, and avoid any space where I might run into him unexpectedly. The folder with the contract was back in Brooklyn, hidden in my nightstand drawer under a pile of old magazines like evidence of a crime I didn't want to find, not even myself. The plan was simple: do my work, eat lunch at my desk, leave on time, and not think about the indecent proposal tucked between an old magazine and my coffee maker's instruction manual. Simple, reasonable, perfectly executable by any adult with a minimum of self-control. It lasted until 11 in the morning. I was walking down the 42nd floor corridor with a stack of reports in my arms, heading to the conference room for an afternoon presentation, when Ronan appeared from the opposite direction. He was coming from his office, coffee cup in hand, sleeves rolled up as always, walking with that wide, unhurried stride that made the entire corridor feel like a runway built just for him. There was no way to avoid him. When we crossed paths, he slowed down, leaned in, and spoke too close to my ear. "Sleep well, Ashford?" His voice traveled through my skin like an electric current. I felt the heat of his body just inches from my arm. He didn't touch me. He didn't even stop. I opened my mouth to give a professional response, but all that came out was a yes that sounded more like a breath than a word. He kept walking as if nothing had happened, leaving me frozen in the corridor, reports pressed to my chest and my heart beating in the wrong place. That was the first provocation. It wasn't the last. On Thursday afternoon, he held the elevator door for too long. I was waiting to go down to reception, and when the doors opened, he was inside, alone, leaning against the back wall with his arms crossed. I got in because the alternative was waiting for the next one and admitting I was running away, and I wouldn't give him that pleasure. The doors closed, and the space that usually felt normal became a metal box that was far too small as his cologne filled the air. He didn't say anything. He just stayed there, watching me through the reflection in the metal doors, with a shadow of a smile that made me count the floors like a countdown to my sanity. During a meeting that same afternoon, he sat at the head of the oval table, while a director presented quarterly results. I was on the other side of the room, my eyes glued to the projection. But somewhere between slide 7 and slide 8, I felt the weight of a gaze and made the mistake of looking. Ronan was staring at me, not casually, but with a deliberate fixation. He held my gaze for 5 long seconds until I was the one who gave in, returning to the screen with my face on fire. On the way out, I made my worst tactical error of the week. I was walking toward my desk with a stack of folders when Ronan passed me. He didn't say a word this time, but his arm brushed against mine. A touch so brief it could have been accidental if it were anyone else, but it was him. That half-second of contact was enough for my hands to lose their grip. 6 folders, reports scattered across the floor, loose pages everywhere. I crouched down, frantically gathering everything, trying to erase the scene before anyone saw. Someone did. Cillian Dark was 3 meters away, leaning against the wall with a coffee cup. He looked at the folders, then at me, then at Ronan, who was walking away without looking back. Cillian raised a single eyebrow. No smile, no comment, just that arched eyebrow. I knew instinctively that was his version of a laugh. I went back to my desk and spent the rest of Thursday hating Ronan Moratini with every fiber of my being. It would have been more convincing if the loudest fiber of all didn't keep replaying the sensation of his skin against mine. On Friday, at 8 at night, the building was nearly empty. I was finishing a report that didn't really need reviewing. I was just looking for a dignified excuse to stay. At 8:15, I shut down my computer and walked to the corridor. I should have turned left toward the elevator and gone home like a sensible person. I turned right, toward his office. The door was ajar, and the light inside was low. Ronan was sitting behind his desk with a glass of whiskey, his sleeves rolled up. He looked up when I entered, showing no surprise. He didn't move or provoke me. He just waited. It was that absence of the game that disarmed me. Without the anger I used as a shield, I had to face the fact that I wanted to be there. I took the contract folder out of my bag. I wasn't sure when I had decided to bring it, but it was there. I placed it on his desk and opened it to the signature page. He didn't say a word. He just pushed a pen in my direction. I took the pen and signed. My hand was firmer than I expected. When I looked up, his gaze was raw, pure desire disguised as patience. Ronan took the pen back, his fingers brushing mine, signed his name, and locked the folder in a drawer. "Come with me," he said. We went down to the garage and got into a black car with tinted windows. The drive was silent, the air between us charged with electricity. Manhattan passed by the window, and with every block, I became more aware that I had just signed a contract to sleep with my boss, and was now heading to his home. The car stopped at a building on the Upper East Side that whispered luxury. We took a private elevator to the top floor. When the doors opened into his penthouse, my breath caught. The space was immense, with floor-to-ceiling windows framing the city like a painting. Ronan didn't turn on the lights. The city lights reflecting off the East River were enough. He turned to me. He had taken off his blazer, and his dark shirt marked his shoulders and chest with a precision that made me swallow hard. He approached with that controlled calm, but his eyes were different now. No games, just direct desire. I touched him first. My hand landed on his chest, feeling his breathing deepen and accelerate. He stood still for a moment, then held my face and kissed me. It was slow at first, as if he were tasting something he had waited too long for. Then, as his hands pulled me against him, the kiss changed. It became urgent and deep. He led me to the bedroom without breaking the kiss. As my clothes came off, I felt a wave of vulnerability, but his hands warmed me, mapping every inch of my skin with focused attention. His mouth moved from my neck to my collarbone, and my body responded before my mind could even process the rhythm. When we finally came together, it wasn't just about control. I found an intensity and a care that contradicted everything he had shown me before. It was the need of someone who hadn't allowed himself to want something this badly in a long time. The climax hit like a wave. I held onto his shoulders, feeling his muscles tense, until everything finally relaxed. He rested his forehead against mine, our heavy breathing mixing in the quiet room. He eventually pulled me close, his arm wrapping around me in a way that felt protective, not possessive. Lying there with him, I thought I should feel regret or confusion, but instead I felt something nameless that scared me more than any contract. Ronan fell asleep first. I stayed awake, listening to the silence that only exists this high up. It was supposed to be just a contract. It was supposed to be simple. But the way he held me, as if he were afraid to let go, wasn't simple at all. Chapter 4. Was everything he gave me a lie? The second week of the contract began on a Monday that smelled of fresh coffee and something I still wasn't ready to put a name to. I opened my eyes in the penthouse bedroom. Not mine, his, which had somehow become the place where I slept. And the first thing I registered was the empty left side of the bed, the sheet still rumpled, the pillow still holding the shape of Ronan's head. Manhattan's light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and the East River glinted outside in that silvery gray shade the city wears on autumn mornings. I got out of bed, pulled on his t-shirt from the chair, far too big on me, the hem landing mid-thigh, and padded down the hallway toward the kitchen. The penthouse had a different kind of quiet in the morning. Without the city's lights competing with the interior lighting, the rooms felt wider and emptier, and the double-height ceiling amplified every small sound. My bare feet on the wood floor, the hum of the coffee maker, the soft click of the refrigerator. Ronan was in the living room, standing at the window with his phone pressed to his ear, his voice pitched low enough that I couldn't pick out the words. He was wearing dark trousers and a white shirt still open at the collar, like he'd dressed halfway before the call pulled him away. When his eyes caught mine, he did something I wouldn't have believed him capable of a month ago. He smiled. Not the polished smile he wore in meetings, not the half-curve he used to provoke me. An unguarded, almost involuntary smile that vanished before it fully settled, as if he hadn't meant to let it through. I retreated into the kitchen and took a mug from the cupboard, trying not to think too hard about what that smile had done to my stomach. The last several days had been a tangle of things I couldn't sort through in my head. The contract was running, and the routine that had taken shape between us didn't resemble anything I'd braced for when I signed my name on Friday night. Ronan was possessive in ways that pressed against my chest. He wanted to know who I talked to, where I went when I wasn't with him, what I did during lunch. The second time I picked up my phone to answer a message from Tessa over dinner, he asked who it was, in a tone that wasn't quite jealousy. It was heavier than that, more controlled, like every person who had access to me was a variable he needed to log. And the driver who took me to work in the mornings wasn't a courtesy. It was a leash dressed up as convenience. But there was the other side, the side that tangled me up, and that I couldn't figure out how to push back against. He took care of me in ways no one ever had. On the third day of the contract, I'd mentioned offhandedly that my coffee maker had broken, and the next afternoon a new one had appeared in my Brooklyn apartment. Not in his, in mine, for the days I wanted to stay there. Once I came home from work with a headache, and before I could even look for something to take, there was a pill waiting on the counter with a glass of water beside it, as if he'd tracked the ache before I had. He noticed things I didn't notice in myself, when I was tired, when something was bothering me, when my silence meant I was spiraling inside my own head and needed someone to reach in and pull me back out. And that was exactly what frightened me, because I was beginning to actually care about him, and caring about a man who controlled everything in his orbit was caring about someone who might, one day, decide to control me until there was nothing left of me to keep. That morning, after coffee, he ended the call and came into the kitchen. He leaned against the doorframe and watched me drink with the intensity I no longer knew how to categorize: want, habit, or something neither of us had been willing to name. I set the mug down on the counter and turned to face him. "You talked to the driver about my schedule today." It wasn't a question. He didn't bother denying it. He folded his arms and studied me, measuring how irritated I was before deciding which answer to hand me. "I rearranged the route so you wouldn't hit the traffic on 3rd. "You rearranged my life," I corrected, and the steadiness in my voice surprised me, as much as it had the day I first told him no. "Ronan, you don't get to decide for me. You don't get to choose what time I leave, which car I take, which route I use. I signed a contract to be with you for a month. I didn't sign over the running of my existence." He was silent long enough that I counted 3 beats of my pulse. Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not cold. The resistance of a man holding back something larger than himself. His arms came down slowly, and he started toward me, then stopped, as if he'd realized closing the distance right now would be the wrong move. "I'll speak to the driver," he said, and his voice came out lower than usual. It wasn't a grand concession. It was the smallest possible give, like he was easing the reins a millimeter at a time, and the effort showed in the tight line of his jaw. But it was something, and I, who should have held my ground and demanded more, felt something soften in my chest when he looked at me with the expression of a man who was actively trying, really trying, to be something less than what he had always been. That was the problem. Even when we were fighting, He made me feel something I'd never felt before. Wanted and important at the same time. Not one or the other. Both. And for a girl who'd spent her life believing she wasn't quite enough, not for the father who left, not for a life that never eased up on her, being seen like that was the most dangerous thing that could happen. By Wednesday of the 3rd week, I woke up to the scent of coffee already hanging in the air. Not the automatic coffee maker that had been programmed for 6:30 since my first day in the penthouse. This was different. Stronger. Fresher. That particular aroma that only comes from coffee made by hand. Beans ground just before. Water at the right temperature. I walked out of the bedroom and down the hall, and the scene in the kitchen stopped me in the doorway. Ronan had his back to me at the counter, a mug in his hand and a second mug beside it, full, steam still rising, set down in the exact spot where I always sat. He was in gray sweatpants and nothing else, and the tattoos that covered his forearms continued across his back in lines I still hadn't fully mapped, though I'd had plenty of chances to try. He heard me, glanced over his shoulder, and gave a small nod toward the second mug. "Woke up early," he said, as if that covered everything. I climbed onto the stool and picked up the mug. The coffee was exactly the way I liked it. Strong, no sugar, just enough milk to lighten the color. I'd never told him how I took my coffee. Not in so many words. Not directly. He'd learned by watching, paying attention every time I poured my own, clocking the amount of milk I added, filing it away without ever asking. It wasn't a grand gesture. No money involved, no drivers, no imported machines. It was small, and that was precisely why it hit me the way it did, with the weight of a quiet blow. Because a man who makes coffee without being asked, who wakes up before you so your mug will be ready when you come in, is a man paying attention in a way that can't be taught and can't be faked. I drank the coffee in silence, legs crossed on the stool, Manhattan glittering through the window behind him, and a truth I'd been postponing since the first week finally settled in to stay. What I was feeling wasn't just attraction. It wasn't the contract. It wasn't the heat of sleeping with the most dangerous man I'd ever met. It was deeper than that, and more frightening. It felt a lot like wanting to stay after the month was over. The next afternoon, Thursday, I stepped out of the 42nd floor office to grab a printout from the copy room at the end of the corridor, near the women's restroom. It had been a long day. Meetings, reports, a spreadsheet that had demanded 3 revisions, and I was distracted enough not to notice I wasn't alone in the corridor, until a voice cut through. Lyra Ashford. I stopped and turned. Selene Caruso stood a few steps behind me, with a black folder cradled against her chest, and a posture that looked like it had been rehearsed in a mirror. Selene was Moritini Holdings' CFO, 29, beautiful in a sharp-edged way, her dark hair pulled into a low knot, and her eyes the approximate temperature of an ice cube. I'd seen her in meetings and hallways, always at a distance, always with the look of a woman who knew more than she let on. "Good afternoon," I said, because courtesy was the only armor I had when I didn't know what was coming. Selene smiled. It was a showroom smile, flawless on the surface, hollow underneath, and sharpened along its edges. "I was going to say the same," she replied, adjusting the folder in her arms with a deliberate, slow motion. "You're settling in well here. 6 months already, isn't it? Time moves quickly when you have the right kind of attention." The phrase "the right kind of attention" wasn't casual. The small pause before the words, the slight arch of her brow, the way her gaze slid down me and back up with an appraisal I felt the way you feel a blade drag along your skin. All of it calculated. "The boss's temporary preferences tend to come with an expiration date," she added, and the showroom smile gained another edge. "But I'm sure you already know that." I didn't know what she was insinuating. I didn't know whether she was talking about the contract, which wasn't possible because no one knew, or about something I hadn't uncovered yet. All I knew was that what had just come out of her mouth had been a stab dressed up in silk, and that the woman standing in front of me wasn't being pleasant. She was marking territory. "Thanks for the concern," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. But I manage my own timelines. Selene looked at me for another beat, like she was weighing whether to swing a second time, or whether the first had landed. Then she stepped to the side, tipped her head, and continued down the corridor with the sound of her heels marking out each step. I didn't go for the printout. I turned into the women's restroom instead, pushed the door open, and leaned against the counter by the sink. My hands were shaking, not from anger, not from fear, but from that specific feeling of a crack opening in a wall I'd assumed was solid. I didn't know what Selene Caruso had with Ronan. Past, present, pure, baseless jealousy. What I knew was that something in her look, in her tone, in her precise word choice, told me there was a piece of the story I hadn't been let in on. I ran cold water over my hands, looked at myself in the mirror, and walked back to my desk pretending nothing had happened. But the comment stayed, lodged at the base of my skull like a low hum I couldn't switch off. A week went by. On the Wednesday of the 4th week, at 9 in the evening, I was still at Moritini Tower. The building had emptied out hours earlier, and the 42nd floor was dark, except for the emergency lights in the corridor, and the lamp I'd left on at my desk. Ronan had gone to a meeting outside the building, one of the ones he mentioned without details, in a tone that didn't invite follow-up, and I needed a vendor contract that had been on his desk earlier in the afternoon. I walked down the dark corridor to the double doors of his office, turned the handle, and stepped inside. The room was lit only by the city's glow through the glass, so I clicked on the desk lamp to find the document. The vendor contract was exactly where I remembered, and I slid it into my folder. I should have left, turned off the light, closed the door, and gone back to my desk. But the side drawer of Ronan's desk was open. Not all the way. An inch, maybe 2. Just enough that I noticed, because that drawer had always been locked. In the 6 months I'd been at the company, every single time I'd been in that office, the second drawer from the top on the left had been shut and secured. I knew because once, months earlier, I'd tried to open it by accident while hunting for a stapler, and it hadn't budged. That night it was open. I should have shut it and walked away, but something in the body responds to a door left ajar as if it were an invitation, and before my rationality could get a word in, my hand was already pulling the drawer the rest of the way out. Inside was a manila folder, unlabeled, thicker than the folders that normally circulated through the office. I took it out and laid it open on Ronan's desk under the lamp. The first pages were bank transfer records, large sums, moving from an account tied to Moritini Holdings to an account whose holder made the blood drop out of my face. Helena Voss, my professor, the woman who had referred me for the position, the woman whose voice I'd trusted when she told me I had potential and that this opportunity was perfect for me. My hands stopped shaking and went cold. Behind the transfer records were printed emails, exchanges between Ronan and a recruitment firm, discussing the construction of a selection process for a specific role in the administrative department. My name was in one of the messages, underlined by hand in black ink. In the last section of the folder, I found my resume, not the clean version I'd sent in, but an annotated copy marked up in Ronan's handwriting, with notes in the margins I didn't have the stomach to read in full, because the first few words had been enough. The entire selection process had been manufactured. The position hadn't existed before me. It had been built around me. The technical exams, the 3 panels of interviews, the confidentiality agreements that had struck me as disproportionate for an administrative role, every part of it had been staged to look real. And Helena Voss's recommendation, the professor I'd admired since my first year of undergrad, the woman I'd believed had put her faith in my ability, she'd been bought, with transfers that added up to more than I'd earn in 2 years at that company. I sat down in Ronan's chair. The leather creaked under my weight, and the office that minutes earlier had been just the office of my boss, the man I slept with, the man I drank morning coffee with, the man I was beginning to feel things for that kept me up at night, suddenly looked like a crime scene. Everything I'd believed, everything I'd used as evidence that the sacrifices had been worth it, that I was enough, that the girl from Brooklyn who'd worked 2 jobs had actually built something real, all of it came apart in seconds. None of this had been merit. None of it had been earned. It had been obsession, control, manipulation, from the very beginning. I closed the folder. My hands weren't trembling anymore. They'd gone cold and precise, the steadiness of someone who had already made a decision before realizing she was making it. I slid the folder into my bag, switched off the lamp, stepped out of Ronan's office, and closed the door behind me without looking back. Chapter 5. I was the plan from the beginning. I waited until he was asleep. Lying beside Ronan in the penthouse bed, his arm across my waist, and his heavy breathing brushing against my shoulder, I stayed perfectly still for 40 minutes measured by the digital clock on the nightstand. At 2 a.m, when I was certain he wouldn't stir, I lifted his arm with a carefulness that ached in my chest, because even knowing what I knew, the weight of it was already missing before I'd finished moving it. I dressed in the dark, grabbed my bag with the folder inside, and crossed the hallway to the private elevator. I pressed the button, the doors slid open, and I went down in silence, my reflection staring back at me in the polished metal. The woman looking at me wasn't crying. She should have been. She wasn't. On the street, New York's cold hit me like an open hand. I flagged a cab at the corner, gave the Brooklyn address, and sat still in the back seat for the 30-minute ride, watching the city slide past the window without registering any of it. Manhattan became the bridge became Brooklyn, and I climbed the 3 flights to my building, locked the door, and sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet beneath the sink. I didn't cry. The pain was too large to fit inside tears. It filled my chest, my throat, my stomach. I tried to separate what had been real from what had been manufactured, and I couldn't, because the two were braided together in a way that made it impossible to pull at one thread without destroying the other. The coffee he made in the mornings, real. The way he looked at me, real. The contract, the position, the professor's referral, all of it constructed. And the worst part was that, underneath the anger and the disgust, I missed him, his arm, the weight of him beside me in bed. Missing someone who had dismantled the one thing you thought you'd earned on your own is the most disorienting kind of pain there is. At 10 in the morning, I was still on the kitchen floor with the folder open beside me when I heard a key turning in the lock. Tessa Wynne let herself in with the spare I'd given her 2 years ago. 12 unanswered calls were, by her standards, plenty of grounds for forced entry. She took in the scene, the papers scattered across the tile, me on the floor, and for once made no jokes. She sat down next to me, leaned her back against the cabinet, and waited. I told her everything. The drawer that had been left open, the folder, the transfers to Helena Voss, the fabricated hiring process, the resume annotated in his handwriting. I kept my voice level, because if I let any emotion in, I wasn't going to make it to the end. Tessa listened without interrupting, and for a woman whose thoughts usually arrived in the world before she'd decided to say them, that silence was the biggest act of love she knew how to offer. When I finished, she looked at me and said, "Do you want to cry? Or do you want to swear? I've got the capacity to do both at the same time, for the record." A short, dry laugh came out of me, the kind that's really a sob wearing a disguise. Tessa put her arm around my shoulders and I finally cried. I cried for the position that had never been mine, for the professor who had sold my trust, for the pride I'd carried every morning stepping into that building thinking I belonged there. And I cried because I missed him, and that was unforgivable. At 4 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Ronan stood in the hallway. No suit, no CEO posture, just a dark t-shirt and jeans, deep shadows under his eyes, his hair falling over his forehead in a way that said he hadn't looked in a mirror. I opened the door but didn't step aside. I stayed in the frame. "I found the folder," I said. He didn't bother pretending to be surprised. His jaw tightened. When his eyes lifted back to mine, there was something in them I had never seen before. Fear. "Tell me the truth," I said. "All of it. From the beginning." He braced one shoulder against the hallway wall and started talking. He said he'd first seen me more than a year ago, at a charity event at the Met. I'd been in a blue dress, laughing near the bar, unaware anyone was watching. He said he'd become obsessed, couldn't let it go. He'd opened the position at the company because of me, paid the professor, designed the entire selection process to bring me into his orbit. "I thought it was just wanting you," he said, and his voice came out rough. "I thought if I could have you close, the obsession would burn itself out. But you weren't who I'd expected. You push back. You take care of me without realizing you're doing it. You're kind in ways nobody else in my life would bother to be. I never planned to feel anything. You changed me. You fabricated the one thing in my life I thought was mine," I said, and the steadiness in my voice covered for the fracture behind it. "I know. I don't want a life under lock and key," I said, and the tears came, but my voice held. "I don't want somebody controlling me. I want freedom. I want to choose. I want someone who can love me without dismantling me in the process." He was silent for a long moment. Then he said, each word sounding like it cost him something, "Then I'll try to change. For you." I closed the door, not as a rejection, as a necessity. I rested my forehead against the cold wood and listened to his footsteps receding on the other side. Slow, one at a time, like each step took effort, like he was forcing his body to walk in the opposite direction of everything it wanted to do. The sound faded, and I stayed there, forehead pressed to the door, tears sliding down my face, alone with the most complicated truth I'd ever had to hold. He had broken the most important thing in my life. And still, already, his absence hurt. Chapter 6. Staying is also a choice. 2 weeks went by before I stopped counting the days. The first few, I didn't leave the apartment. Tessa came over every day, sometimes with food, sometimes just herself, which was more than I could have asked for. I slept badly, woke up with swollen eyes, and spent my morning sitting at the kitchen counter staring at my phone without unlocking it, because there were 32 missed calls from Ronan, and I didn't trust my voice to take a single one of them. He sent messages for the first 3 days. I read everyone without answering. On the 4th day, he wrote only, "I'll be here when you're ready." No deadline. After that, he went quiet. By the 2nd week, I went back to work. Not to Moritini. I couldn't set foot in that building without feeling the floor start to give way under me. I requested leave by email, and to my surprise, the reply came from HR, not from him. Approved. No questions, no conditions. I didn't know if that was respect or strategy, and the not knowing ate at me almost as much as the pain did. I spent those days in the apartment rewriting my resume, sending emails to other companies, trying to rebuild what he had taken apart, and realizing with every interview I lined up that the competence had always been mine. The tests I'd passed, the answers I'd given, the hours I'd studied, nobody had fabricated those. He'd opened the door, but the person who'd walked through it and kept her feet under her was me. On the 15th day, I woke up, and the first thing I registered was that the apartment felt different. Not the apartment itself. The walls were unchanged. The light filtered through the same thin curtains. The fridge kept up the same low hum. It was me. The weight that had pinned me to the kitchen floor was still there, but it had lost its grip on me. The grieving had happened. The fury had happened. The humiliation had happened. And what remained, after 2 weeks of waking up alone and learning to sort what had been a lie from what had been real, was a clarity with no soft edges that at least let me see what I needed to decide. I went into the bathroom, turned on the faucet, and rinsed my face with cold water. The mirror gave me back a version of myself I hadn't met in days. My eyes were still swollen, and my skin had that pallor you only lose with sleep, but underneath was something that resembled steadiness. Not courage, steadiness. Courage is when fear isn't there. Steadiness is when fear is there, alive in your chest, and you move anyway. I dried off and walked to the living room. I sat cross-legged on the couch, and for the first time since that night in his office, I let myself think without anger running interference. I thought about my father, about the man who walked out when I was 7, the one I waited for at the window for weeks with the stubborn belief he had to be coming back, because at that age I hadn't yet learned that people can simply leave. He never did. And my mother stayed with 2 jobs, with bills past due, with a daughter who was already figuring out too early that anything good could disappear without warning. I'd grown up with that knowledge lodged in my body, an invisible scar shaping every decision I made. Don't get too attached. Don't trust too easily. Don't let anyone close enough that losing them could break you. I thought about my mother, about the woman who stayed, who didn't walk away when leaving would have been easier, who chose day after day to keep going, not because life was kind, but because staying was the right decision even when it hurt. My mother had never told me staying was easy. She told me it was a choice, and that sometimes the right choice was the one that cost the most. And I thought about Ronan, about the man who had manipulated me, who had fabricated my opportunity, who had pulled me into his orbit because he wanted something under his control, but also the man who had shown up at my door without any of his armor, no suit, no layers, none of the costumes he wore to face the rest of the world, who had told me the truth when he could easily have handed me an explanation soft enough to make me stay without pain, who had said he would try to change, and then walked away when I asked him to, even though every step in that hallway had cost him more than he was used to paying. He left. That was the part I couldn't put down, because the man I'd known for 6 months, the one who controlled, monitored, suffocated, wouldn't have left. He would have stayed, pressed, found an angle to make me bend. But that afternoon at my door, he'd listened to what I said, answered with 3 words, and turned in the opposite direction. For the first time, Ronan Moritini had not controlled the ending, and that meant something, maybe the only thing it could mean. At 3 in the afternoon, I went out on foot. Brooklyn in early November had lost the gold of the leaves and taken on that gray of nearly bare branches that made the streets feel honest. No decoration, no disguise, exactly what they were. I walked the 6 blocks to Prospect Park with my hands buried in my coat pockets and cold air filling my lungs. The park was quiet for a Friday. A few runners, a couple with a dog, a woman reading on a bench near the water. I picked an empty bench with a view of the lake and watched the trees changing color on the far shore. Ronan showed up 10 minutes later. I hadn't expected him. I hadn't told him where I'd be, hadn't answered my phone, hadn't left any trail. And there he was anyway, walking up the dirt path with his hands in his pockets, and a posture that wasn't the CEO's and wasn't the predator's. It was the posture of a man who didn't know whether he was welcome and was trying to work it out without asking. He sat down beside me. No touch, no pressure, no words until I spoke first. "How did you find me?" I asked, eyes still on the lake. You told me once this was where you came when you needed to think, he said, voice low, no arrogance in it. It was the only place I could think of. I tried to remember when I'd said that. Maybe one morning in the penthouse. Maybe in some conversation I hadn't even logged as important. He had logged it. And the fact that he'd come here on the strength of one offhand sentence I didn't even remember making, instead of sending Cillian out to track me, meant something. It wasn't control. It was attention. You don't get to build my life without asking me anymore, I said, still looking at the water. I'm not a project. I'm not something you acquire. I'm not a position you create and fill when you decide you want to. I need room to be who I am, to make my own decisions, to make my own mistakes without someone controlling every variable around me. Loving somebody isn't that. Loving somebody is letting the person choose to stay, knowing they can leave. Ronan didn't answer right away. I glanced at him and saw his jaw locked, his eyes fixed on some point in front of us, his hands pressed against each other like he was holding himself back from saying the wrong thing. When he did speak, the voice wasn't the one that gave orders on the 42nd floor. It was lower, rougher, and it carried the weight of a man learning how to do something he had never done. I don't know how to be anything other than what I am, he said. I spent my whole life controlling everything because it was the only way I knew how not to lose. But I'll try. I'm not going to promise perfect, because I don't know how to promise that. But I'll try. For you. I looked at him, and in his eyes I saw something I had never seen across all the months we'd spent together. Fear. Not the calculated fear of someone who assesses risk and prepares for the worst. Real fear. The fear of losing me. And a man who is afraid of losing you is a man who has learned to value, because you only fear losing what you've understood matters. Then he told me the last thing that had been quietly chewing at me. He said he'd found out who had left the drawer open that night at the office. Celine Caruso. The CFO with the showroom smile who had told me the boss's preferences came with expiration dates. Celine had moved out of resentment. She'd wanted to destroy whatever was between us, and she'd found the cleanest way to do it. Make sure I opened the drawer she knew I'd open. Ronan told me Celine had already been removed from the company and cut out of the family circle. There had been no revenge and no scene, just a final consequence, and she was gone from his life and mine. Knowing it was sabotage didn't dull what I'd felt that night. The documents were real. The manipulation was real. The professor had been paid. The selection process had been fabricated. None of that changed. But it explained something that had been grinding at me since. The drawer I'd seen locked for 6 months, open on the one night I was alone in his office. It hadn't been chance. It had been a trap. And knowing that closed something I hadn't been able to stop staring at. I chose to stay. At 9 that night, the car pulled up in front of Ronan's building on the Upper East Side, and I went up in the private elevator for the first time as a choice, not as part of a contract, not as the result of a provocation, but because I had decided I wanted to be there. The doors slid open, and I stepped into the penthouse that had looked like a beautiful prison the last time I'd been inside it, and now looked like something else. I didn't know if it was home. I didn't know if it was a new beginning, but it was something I was willing to find out. Ronan was standing by the window in the living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, the posture of a man waiting without knowing whether the waiting would be worth it. When he saw me, he set the glass down slowly on the sideboard. I walked over and stopped 1 step from him. He met my eyes, and I saw the question he wasn't going to ask. I answered the only way that made sense. I closed the last step and put my arms around him. He held me back with a strength that wasn't possession. It was relief. We went out to the balcony afterward, watching Manhattan glitter below with the East River drawing its dark line between the two halves of the city. He stood behind me with his arms around my waist and his chin resting on my head, and he said something low, almost to himself, a phrase in Italian I didn't understand. The words came out with an accent I hadn't heard from him before, and his voice dropped deeper, more natural, like that language was the place where he kept the things he didn't know how to say in English. "What does that mean?" I asked. He smiled against my hair. I felt the shape of it before I heard the answer. "I'll tell you later." I laughed. He pulled me in closer, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Not because everything was perfect, not because everything was resolved, but because I had chosen to stay, and the choice had been mine. But as I was drifting off, leaning against his chest with the slow rhythm of his heartbeat against my ear, one thought slipped through before I closed my eyes. He had switched languages so fast it was like watching someone else slide into his skin. His voice had gone deeper, harder, with a cadence that wasn't the cadence of a man who'd picked up Italian as a hobby. And the lion tattooed on his left forearm, tucked in among the other designs, I had never asked what it actually meant. The thought passed. I closed my eyes and slept, but tomorrow always comes. Lena here. That wraps up book 1, and I've already finished book 2. You can get access to it for a really small fee. After everything, Lyra thought she knew Ronan Moratini completely. The obsession, the control, the truth about the hiring. She faced every piece and chose to stay. He was changing. She was trusting. Until the biggest lie of all, the one he'd been hiding since before she existed in his life, exploded in a way neither of them could control. She discovered he wasn't just a CEO, and that his world had a door that, once opened, never closes again. Lyra had already run once and come back, but this time, coming back means becoming part of something that could cost everything, including her life. Like I said, that was just a taste of book 2. To watch it uncensored, just click on the first link here in the pinned comment. I'll see you on the other side in a few seconds. Remember, just click on the first link down here in the comments, and book 2 complete, no ads, no interruptions, will already be available for you. It's very simple. Book 2 is something I'm loving making. You're loving it too, so I promise there will be more. It's where you find increasingly spicy stories, a true dark romance. And precisely because this version is getting more and more heated, the video isn't well accepted publicly on YouTube. This closed environment is where I can actually share my essence and where I feel free to do my best work for you. More news coming soon. I'll be waiting for you on the other side.